Good morning, my name is Lina Moreira. I'm here for GNP Idiomas, and we are putting together a series of teacher tutorials to help teachers, starting off to teach children at an intermediate level, okay? 12, 13-year-olds. Today we're going to be talking about reported speech, all right? There are three main verbs in reported speech. The verbs are said, told, and asked, okay? There are a lot of reporting verbs, over 150 of them, but these are the main ones that we need to use to be able to report what people say. So the first one is the verb said, say, said. Those are for statements, so very easy. Let's say we have a basic sentence, she's leaving, or she's leaving, let's say. Okay? If you want to report that, you begin with, she said. Okay? That is optional, that's why it's in brackets. And we have some changes to make, okay? The first change, obviously, are pronouns. Sometimes we need to change the pronouns because the person who is speaking is not the person who is reporting that. Tense change most of the times, and time reference changes as well, okay? Here I have none of those. I mean, I'm going to keep the she because it's not necessary to change the pronoun. The changes are usually logical and you can see what you need to change and when. I will need to change the verb, and I don't have a time reference. So she said that she, so here's the verb, she is leaving. In reported speech, the rule is that in reported speech, the tense goes one back. So if it's present continuous, it would now move to past continuous, okay? So she said that she was leaving, okay? If I had a reference to time, let's say tomorrow, then I would need to change that. I'll give you a list of changes, the most common changes, once you get the structure, okay? So that would be the most basic one, okay? If it were a question, let's say, questions, let's move down to the bottom, all right? Now let's say the question is she leaving, okay? All right, that's a simple question. That would be a yes-no question. And if this is a yes-no question, we use if or whether to report that. So she asked me, for instance, if or whether, makes no difference, she was leaving. Now, here you have to be careful about word order, all right? This order is a question order. You've got the auxiliary in front of the subject. But when you have a reporting statement or a question like this, it is no longer a question, so it comes affirmative. She was leaving. We're changing the tense, as we did in the original there at the top in the statement, to the past continuous, all right? So that would be for a question that's a yes, no. But let's say we have an information question. Where is the post office, all right? If I wanted to report that, she asked, whoever asked, I don't know, she asked me, I've got the WH question word, I've got to keep that. She asked me where, again, I have to be careful with word order. This is a question order, I need to put that into affirmative. So, where, the post office, this is the verb in present, I've got to switch that to the past. And it's at the very end, okay? That would be for questions, okay? Let's go to statements where I have an object, okay? That's the main difference, in fact. Very confusing for kids. The difference between said and told is that both of them for statements, said there is no object, told there is always an object, okay? So, I have an original sentence. Let's say, she's leaving. Same sentence. And I've got, she said to the kids, okay? So that's the sentence. So the kids would be the object, all right? I'm going to change that into she told the kids. That is optional, but I can put it in. She was leaving, okay? I'm just giving you a basic outline. I'm using the same sentence so you can see the changes and the variations so it's easier to teach, all right? So we've got the statements with objects, and both question forms, okay? It's absolutely it makes no difference whether you use if or whether. The only time you must use whether if you have an infinitive verb afterwards. I don't know whether to go or stay, but that's not the case. You would never have that in this sort of situation, so you don't need to look into that. But if they were to ask you, that is the only way, that is the only difference between these two. So that's the basics. Now let's look at commands and requests. They're a little trickier. A command would be something like sit down, okay? So let's say I have sit down. It's a command. Clear, sit down. So I have to use an infinitive for that. She told me, or us, or them, or whoever, to sit down, okay? If it were a negative, so don't do that, would be, she told me not to do that, or not to sit down if it were negative, okay? So that's a command. But what about a request? Very similar and often confused. I can say sit down, and that's a direct command, or I can say, would you mind sitting down? That would be a request, but I'm still asking you to do something. Instead of saying it directly, I'm asking you. So let's just erase this because I need this bottom part. Let's say the sentence is, instead of sit down, the question is, would you mind sitting down? Now, it's just a more polite way of saying sit down. So what's the difference? Instead of saying she told me, I'm going to say she asked me. But I'm not going to report the whole thing. I'm not going to say she asked me if I wouldn't mind sitting down. It's so much more complicated. It's easier if you just say she asked me to sit down. So the difference being this verb here. You see, here I'm using the verb told because it's an order, and here I'm using the word asked because it's a request. Okay? So that's the three main verbs and the structures that you will find that you would need to teach at an initial stage. Okay? Now let's look at the changes. All right? So let me erase this. The pronoun changes are common sense. They depend on the situation and what sentence and who's speaking, who's listening, and how they are reporting that. Okay? But the verb changes are simple. And they also must be learned, okay? If it's a present simple, so if the direct speech is in present simple, then the reported speech would be in past, okay? Again, very easy to learn. Present goes to past, all right? Present simple goes to past simple. Present continuous goes to past continuous. All right? And that follows through. Now, the past here, the past simple and continuous, I'm just going to abbreviate that, will go into, now this is a tricky one. It can remain in past. Okay? Past simple or continuous. It can remain. Or it can go into past perfect. Simple and continuous. That's up to the speaker. Okay? The trick is in some exams where you're going to do it directly from direct to indirect, it's simple. But if you have to go backwards, it can be tricky because now if you're starting with the past and you have to tell the person what was said originally, you could get into trouble because it might be the present or it might be the past. So that's tricky. The same thing with the present perfect. Present perfect goes into past perfect, simple and continuous. Past perfect. So if you're moving from this side backwards, this one could go to a present perfect, but it could be the past simple. So you have to look at the sentence and look at the time references to be able to decide what's being said. Okay? Going to, so I am going to, or is or are, obviously the present, would go into was or were going to. Okay? These are the more basic verbs. Okay? Now let's look at some other ones that you have to memorize. Will goes to would. In one other tutorial we did talk about would being the past of will. May goes to might. Can, obviously, goes to could. That's an easy one. Must goes to had to. Okay? So the last thing we saw were the verb changes, and now let's talk about the time reference changes, all right? Now that the board is wiped. Let's say that in the original sentence I have today, then in reported speech that goes to that day. Okay? Now goes to then. All right? You can find this list anywhere. In most teacher manuals you will find it. It's these ones that they get stuck on. They'll remember yesterday or they'll remember next week, but the ones like that are a little out of the ordinary they have difficulty with. Things like here goes to there, and this goes to that. All right? These changes need to be memorized. There are more. If the time reference is tomorrow, then in reported speech I will change it to the following day. Or the day after. Alright? This applies to day, but it also applies to next week, month, or year. Okay? Again, tomorrow would be the following day or the day after. Next week would be the following week or the week after. Okay? So these here would switch to that. Yesterday goes to the day before or the previous day. Okay? And again, the same thing with last week, month, and year. All right? All of these have this sort of change, the day before or the previous, sorry, I missed that day. Okay? Another one, the last one. What about if it's in 2 weeks? So I'm leaving for Jamaica in 2 weeks. Let's just erase the top part here. In 2 weeks becomes in 2 weeks time. Notice the apostrophe after the S because that's the original is a plural. If it were a singular, let's say it's in 1 week, 1 month, in 1 month, it would be in 1 months, so the apostrophe before the S, okay, in 1 month's time. So these are the ones that they get stuck on, and these are the ones that you have to emphasize and give examples of, okay? Well, great, thank you very much. This is it for the tutorial.